Hey there, Rednecks, Preppies, Redneck Preppies. It's me, the Redneck Preppy. How you doing today? Great. Good. No, really. I do hope you're doing good. It's crazy out there these days. Take care of yourself, all right? So I'm sometimes asked, what is the worst firearm I've ever owned? And in all honesty, most of the firearms I bought have been fairly good. There are three, however, that I wish I'd never caught sight of. And today I'm going to talk about the worst firearm I ever bought as a hopefully instructive example to collectors who jump before they think. So the three firearms. Well, the first was a sported 1913 Lee Enfield No. 1 Mark III SMLE that I bought in about 2014 with the eye to restoring it. That project rapidly turned into quicksand as I dumped more and more money into something that, at the time, wasn't worth it. The second was an M1916 Spanish Mauser I picked up in 2019. Now, there's nothing wrong with the rifle itself. I just really did not enjoy shooting it. I'm not sure why. Outside of that, I found the recoil to be really unpleasant. Odd, because I've fired all sorts of rifles, some with far heavier recoil than that rifle, and I never had a problem with felt recoil. But by far, the biggest catastrophe I ever experienced in the world of older firearms was an 1870 Danish rolling block rifle I bought back in 2016. Here it is. Oh no, wait, I don't have it anymore. I can't show it to you, thank God. The number of ways I hate that rifle to this day can hardly be counted. True. So back in 2016, I sauntered into my local gun store, and as is my habit, I asked the owner what new toys did he have for me to look at. And dutifully, he presented a rifle and proudly noted that it was a Danish rolling block rifle made by Husqvarna, better known today for their lawnmowers and chainsaws. And it was from the year 1870. It was chambered in the 8x58mm RD round, one I have to admit I wasn't familiar with at the time. And it could be mine for only a few $100s. Well, he didn't need to sell me any further. Old rifle check, oddball caliber check, interesting action, baby. I paid for it that instant and I took it home. But a problem immediately arose. How am I going to shoot this rifle? All my rifles get shot. There are no safe queens allowed in my world. The 8x58mm RD cartridge, I learned, hadn't really been produced in significant quantities since the 1940s, though Norma had apparently manufactured some in the past. Reloading was the obvious answer. Well, except for the fact that none of the major companies were producing reloading dice for that caliber. Some had in the past, I think Hornady was one, but reaching out to all the companies netted nothing. Well, there is always a way to get to where you want to go, and after doing some extensive research on the types of forums where people talk about calibers that very few people remember, I learned that CH4D, a tool and die maker out of Mount Vernon, Ohio, occasionally produced dies for 8x58. So I called CH4D. I even talked to the company's owner, who answers the phone himself, and learned that they would be making another run of those dies in about 8 months. I placed an order and waited. Dutifully, in the fall of 2017, my dies finally came in, and for only $250 Canadian. Now, to give you an idea how outrageous that is, regular dies up here in Canada are only about 50 or 60 bucks. Of course, now I had dies, but the next big problem was components and load data. When I said they hadn't manufactured the round in decades, that includes the brass as well. At least I couldn't find any. Fortunately, some research showed that Mannlicher Schoenhauer 8x56mm brass could substitute for 8x58mm RD. And the R stands for rimmed, by the way. This is important. It wasn't perfect. The rolling blocks extractor was made for rimmed brass, so I'd have to kind of manually pull a spent case out of the rifle's breech some of the time. And obviously 8x56 is a little bit shorter than 8x58, but 8x56 was at least easy to buy. relatively speaking. The load data was a little more difficult. Now, this is a round that basically only existed in Europe. So the data I could find was often old and based on European gunpowders that generally weren't available in Canada. So I had to do something I don't particularly care for, develop my own data based on assumptions and examples from other kind of similar calibers. I played around with a few powders, H4831 Shortcut, H335, H322. And if I remember correctly, I think I ended up using 42.5 grains of H4831. That's not load data you should trust, by the way. Just saying that's what I used. Now for bullets, I decided to go with 195 grain bullets, mostly because I had plenty of them from my reloading of 8mm Mauser. Okay, I had the rifle, I had some ammunition now. After over a year, I could finally take the rifle out to the range. Well, that's when the difficult journey got worse. I decided to shoot at 50 yards to begin with, just so I could get a sense of where the bullets would end up. I dutifully shot 5 rounds, and after retrieving my paper, I only found 3 bullet holes, and 2 of them were keyholed. Now, just in case you're unaware of what keyholing is, it's when a fired bullet essentially tumbles in flight and it doesn't strike the target with its, point. The most extreme example is when you see it on paper striking sideways, as you can see in the image on the screen. This is not a good thing. It means that the bullet was not stabilized or something affected its flight to make it unstable, such as a damaged bore or a barrel crown. Well, I didn't want to encourage the thought in my head that I had a bad bore, and I didn't see anything wrong with the barrel's crown. So I went home and I began testing more combinations of powders and bullet weights, all the way up to 220 grains in the latter's case. More trips to the range, more of the same result. The rifle's bore was in fact damaged. I ended up running a bore scope through it later and it confirmed it. I towed it around with having the barrels, replaced, but I ended up deciding against it. But that wasn't the rifle's only problem. Shooting it was unpleasant. I mean, really unpleasant. Now, I'm a fairly sizable human being, and I've fired all sorts of ammunition out of all sorts of rifle, from the very small to the very large. I am largely recoil insensitive. That 8mm round of the rolling block was by far the worst experience. But I don't mean in terms of felt recoil, but rather much of the recoil seemed to transmit itself into the trigger area, leading within literally a few shots to a numb trigger finger. And trust me, pulling a trigger with a numb finger is kind of actually painful, and it's a pain in the ass. I literally, every few rounds, had to switch the trigger that I used to pull the trigger in order to avoid having that finger go completely numb. I have never, having put more rounds downrange than I could possibly estimate, ever experienced that before or since. Everything else about that rifle shot normally, but the concentration of vibration or whatever it was in the trigger area made shooting it a nightmare. Well, another, range trip, it was July 23rd, 2019, to be specific, where I saw nothing but keyholing rounds. I just had enough. A friend who was at the range at the same time liked old rifles, and he wanted a wall hanger, and he offered to buy the rifle, and I accepted on the spot. I managed to later offload the Mannlicher Schoenauer brass and the CH4D dies to another person who actually had a functioning rolling block in that caliber. Must be nice. There are rifles that I sold many years ago that I still miss. I regret selling in 2018-ish a 1936 Tula manufactured Mosin Nagant M9130 that I bought in 2014. clean rifle in great condition that I sold because I convinced myself that I had too many rifles right before I essentially doubled my collection. That rolling block rifle, I don't miss it in the slightest. It was nothing but a gigantic pain in the rear. It wasn't an expensive rifle, but it cost too much for something that couldn't reliably hit paper at 50 yards thanks to bullets tumbling. Reloading was a pain, given that the dies cost a ton of money. Shooting that rifle was awful because it actually caused me physical pain to do so. So, what did I learn from this? And hopefully that you can take away from this little story time. Well, do your research. I say this in every video that sees me discuss collecting military surplus arms. Had I bothered to look into this rifle, the availability of ammunition, the difficulty of reloading, I'd have walked away. And also, Occam's razor is a thing for a reason. I didn't want to admit to myself that the rifle may have had a mechanical issue, which would have prevented it from firing accurately no matter what hand loads I developed for it. Bore scoping would have answered that question at the beginning. Hell, maybe looking down the bore at the shop would have, resolved that issue too. Another. And finally, don't be afraid to walk away from a firearm. Sometimes these things aren't going to work out. Yes, I could have had it rebarreled and probably solved my problem, at least in terms of accuracy. But at that point, I'd already put a lot of money into a rifle that really didn't merit it. Getting rid of it probably saved me money and further grief. So that is the worst rifle I ever owned. It's not the worst story of firearms grief ever told, but it is my pain. And if you have any stories about misguided firearms purchases, feel free to leave them in the comments section below. I would love to hear your experiences. At any rate, hope you found today's video to at least be vaguely entertaining and mildly informative. As always, I hope your forays into old rifles are always pleasant. Take care, and bye-bye.